All right. Happy Black History Month, first and foremost, and welcome to another episode of A Day with Dre. So, I mentioned before that I was going to do some smaller episodes, a mini series about things related to Black History Month with everything going on. I think the importance of DEI should be mentioned. So, we'll have some mini episodes on different areas of DEI and especially in terms of Black history. So, today we're going to talk about why DEI in healthcare is important in regards to Black History Month. But of course, before we get into it, make sure you subscribe, like, follow A Day with Dre wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Spotify, Apple Podcast, visual episodes available on YouTube, clips on TikTok, Instagram, wherever you take in information. A Day with Dre podcast will be on there. Again, any subscription, like, comment, follow, whatever is always appreciated. Make sure you get that done. All right, let's get to it. So, again, with this theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why it's important in terms of healthcare for Black people in particular, because again, this is Black History Month. We're going to talk about the history of healthcare in America in regards to Black citizens. Very briefly, we could talk about this for months. This honestly could be an entire course, but we're going to just really get into why DEI is important in regards to that, because a lot of the history are things that people have never talked about. So I think it is well known that Black Americans have significant health care disparities. But what is a health care disparity? That's something that is significant and avoidable. And again, that's the key term: avoidable difference in health status, disease burden, access to health care, etc. So again, these things are supposed to be avoidable. That's what makes it a healthcare disparity. So why do Black Americans face disparities? And that answer is large and complex. You can easily chalk it up to systemic racism. But even in areas where some of that has been, I guess, corrected, there's still medical mistrust. And where does that come from? Of course, history of racism. So if you don't know the history of racism in healthcare, I'll give you a few examples. We're trying to give a nice little synopsis of why this is important, and you can't have this education without diversity, equity, and inclusion. But let's just start with a few notable examples, all right? So Dr. Sims, back in the 1800s, is considered the father of the OB-GYN profession, right? Which is all things related to female reproductive system care. How did Dr. Sims get the knowledge to be crowned the king of OB-GYN? Well, he was a South Carolina doctor, went over to Alabama or Mississippi down in the mid 1800s and would just take slaves, Black women, and do all types of experiments on them with no anesthesia, essentially treated them worse than lab rats. They weren't viewed as people, they were viewed as property. So I'm sure it's not even documented how many people actually probably perished under his experimentation. So many different African women bled out, died of disease, died of infection because he just treated them like animals, experimenting on them, making sure they got pregnant, trying different versions of cesarean sections, forcing them to deliver, etc. He can be looked into, and you can see the things that he did to people. And I remember a few years ago when in New York State, they took down his statue, and everybody was making a big deal about it, saying how this was an important person in American sciences, and that you can't judge someone by the standard of today, blah, 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 and that tired ass argument. So that's one example of historical context. And again, keep in mind, that's not even 200 years ago. So like that's a few generations removed. So obviously stories get passed on. Like, for example, I'm a descendant of the African American slave trade, and I knew my great great grandmother whose grandparents were slaves. So we're not that far removed from that. And people tell stories. And another example, Henny Lax, and this is 1951. Henrietta Lack is responsible for the HeLa cell, which is like the first immortal cell discovered. I believe it was a cervical cancer. Her tissue was taken against her knowledge, and HeLa cells are probably responsible for more pharmaceutical and medical advancement, at least modern medical advancement, than any other single discovery, because she had cells that wouldn't die, so that allowed long-term testing and the advancements that came from it. I know the polio vaccine came from it. I think even the COVID vaccine. So again, we're talking the 2020s. They're still getting advancements from the HeLa cells, and it was taken against her knowledge. Her family didn't get anything out of it, and I'm sure the amount of money gained downstream from her body, it's well into the billions, I'm sure, about it. And again, this is 1950s. So a lot of you have grandparents that were, that's in their timeline where things like that happen. And then probably the most commonly known thing that happened to Black Americans is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which went from 1930s to 1970s. And Black men with syphilis some were not even told they had syphilis. Some were given syphilis. All of them were told they were being treated. They had a control group that was actually treated, but a lot of them weren't being treated. And meanwhile, for the majority of this experiment, again, this went into the 70s, so we're talking a lot of your parents were alive during this experiment, so they were withheld proper medical treatment. And I'm not going to get into all the science behind syphilis, but it can be passed on to a partner, of course. So in this case, some of these men gave it to their wives. Their wives passed it to their newborn, and congenital syphilis is devastating to a child. So again, and the treatments being withheld from these people up into the 70s, and the only reason it was brought to light was because there was a whistleblower that finally decided to expose this. So again, this is well after the Civil Rights Act, etc. The crazy thing about the Tuskegee part is the organization that would then become the CDC. So again, this is a national organization, was sponsoring the research. So it's not like these are some rogue doctors that were responsible for this. This is the literal government. So those are really some of the bigger things that people know about. Again, like I said, people's parents were alive as that Tuskegee syphilis experiment was going on. It's crazy. And then other things that are not as well known are med schools used to pay grave robbers to specifically go and get the corpses of Black. So of course they're still pretty fresh, because you need a fresh corpse. They would get the corpses of fresh deceased Black people, because they knew that people wouldn't care as much if Black bodies went missing. And that's responsible for a lot of the advancements that we have in our understanding of anatomy, which helps with surgical procedures and things like that. So again, just complete disregard for kind of the humanity of Black people. And again, these are all examples of just things here in America. This isn't around the world. And some of the interesting things about the timing of this is, especially in terms of like informed consent and not being able to experiment on people. So in Europe, back in the 80s, there was a very famous trial called the Nuremberg trials, and one of the big things that come out of it were the Nazis and their crimes against humanity, and they were medically experimenting on people in the Holocaust. So one of the Nuremberg codes was that it is literally a crime against humanity to experiment on humans, and that's worth going to war over. So, of course, the United States played a part in the trial of members of the Third Reich, yet in their own country back here, they were just letting Black people be experimented on by the government. And so it's just, again, crazy how, and it's not a comparison, this is not an oppression Olympics, but it's just crazy the mental gymnastics that things that occurred and still continue to occur. So yeah, like when you think about healthcare in America in regards to Black people, there are some systemic issues, of course, but there's also just a general mistrust, and it's not hard to imagine why there's a general mistrust when you're not even entire generations removed from state-sponsored experimentation on people. And the word gets out, you wonder why there was so much apprehension in the Black community against the COVID vaccine. And then you got to realize that some of these people's grandparents are directly connected to people from the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So, how this relates to DEI, this stuff isn't taught. And DEI is not just hiring people and putting them in position. It's about making sure that you understand diversity, equity, and inclusion and things related to it. So this goes into educating. Are we teaching about these things in your medical ethics courses? Are you teaching about these things and biology and anatomy? So it all matters. So this goes beyond just saying a person deserves to have this job. DEI is a lot broader than that. Of course, healthcare disparities go into socioeconomic factors, and where does that come from? History of systemic racism. But what are examples of healthcare disparities in Black people? Okay, we talked about historical reasons that Black people have mistrust, and that of course leads to part of the disparities. But let's talk about the actual raw data. Okay, so over double the rate, okay, almost 2.5 times the rate, Black women have complications during pregnancy and during childbirth than the rest of their American counterparts. So how in the year 2025 is that even possible? Black people don't have different anatomy. So what's going on? Why is it so much more dangerous to give birth as a Black female? Why is it so much more dangerous? And this is a rhetorical question, because there is data that actually shows, and I'll make sure I link this data in the bio when I post this episode. There's data that shows that when being cared for by other Black doctors, which are roughly 5% of physicians, Black women actually have morbidity and mortality rates. So complications, disease, or death, their rates are much better, meaning they're less, simply just from being treated by a Black physician. Now, is that me saying that physicians that aren't Black are racist? That's not what I'm saying at all. But the data is saying that when Black physicians take care of Black women, they do better. There's plenty of examples of this. When Black physicians take care of Black men, heart disease goes down. When Black physicians take care of Black men and women, blood pressure on average is lower. So what does that say about our healthcare system? It's certainly an indictment, to say the least. And as I'm a physician myself, and our healthcare system is not teaching you to go out and be racist. That's certainly not what's happening. I was never, I went to a medical school where there were very few Black people, but we weren't taught to go and disregard Black people's health. So why is this happening? Why, when you equalize for income, because that's one of the main things people go to, well, it's income, it's access to insurance. Yes, Black people are generally poorer. They're on average have poorer insurance. Even when you equalize all of these different factors, Black people have worse outcomes, but when they're treated by Black people, the outcomes get better. So there's already an incredibly low amount of Black physicians. I stated that earlier. There's 5% of physicians are Black, but we're about 13.5% of the population, give or take. So there is a discrepancy there. Also, it's not even, people tend to feel more comfortable when their physician looks like them, but the biggest drop off is when Black people see physicians that aren't Black. They have much less ideal outcomes in healthcare. But if a Black physician is treating a white patient, that's typically pretty consistent with if they were seeing another white physician. So again, I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but that's what the data says. So in healthcare specifically, DEI is understanding that these issues are in this specific population of people. There's really just no other way to talk about it other than saying that Black people are having these issues because they are Black. And that's under the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to be able to look into the reasons why Black people, simply by being Black, are having more problems in America. in regards to healthcare? Why are there certain cancers that are easily, or I shouldn't say easily treatable? Why are there more cancers that are killing more black people than white people when white people are having the cancer at a much higher rate? Why, you know, why are black women suffering much more vastly from child rearing issues? Why America is just not doing great when it comes to OB-GYN in the first place, but why are black women in particular in the richest country in the world, as Americans like to say, why are they having results that are similar to what we would call a third world nation? Why? It's not acceptable. And talking about all of these things, and that didn't even actually touch the fact that just 60 years ago, Jim Crow existed, and that made it so a lot of hospitals that actually had resources to treat people, black people weren't even allowed to. We talk about all these different things that have black people's mistrust in their healthcare providers, and didn't even hit on the biggest thing, was that for a lot of places it was just against the law for them to receive healthcare at decent institutions. And even still today, and again, I'm going to post where I get all this information to, there's studies that say that even when you have the same healthcare when black people are, picked up by an ambulance, they are on average admitted to places that are across the board perceived to be less quality hospitals than their white counterparts, even with the same health insurance. And why? So part of the issue is over half the counties in the United States don't even have black healthcare providers. And if you think about that, if over half the counties don't have black healthcare providers, but it's shown that having black healthcare providers gives better results, then that already puts people behind the ball, right? So these things are important to talk about, but unfortunately, and it's being pushed by our government right now, when you bring up race and how things related to race matter and how they're important and how there are issues that exist and they're simply existing because of race, you try to put in things to correct these racial disparities, or in other cases, gender disparities, or, insert whatever stratifier disparity. They call it reverse racism when they say it's discriminating against people and we need to just worry about merit, but apparently this is not important. It really is. It's disgusting. It's unfortunate. And the worst part about it is, I would say, so like a lot of the examples I talked about, you can say we grow out of it. This is generational. And there were polls of up as recently as 2020 with med students. So again, I was in med school in 2020. So these are the current physicians or people that are about to lead the healthcare in America. And there were still thoughts that black people had better pain tolerance, they had thicker skin, they tend to be much more drug seeking. And of course, these are anonymous surveys because they know those are things that you shouldn't say, but these are things that people feel. And those same people would say, well, that's just what reality shows, so that's not racism. But these biases or these thoughts will influence how you take care of people. And these are my classmates that are feeling these things. So, of course, disparities are going to exist when you're not taking someone's pain seriously, or you think their anatomy is different. And that plays into RFK recently was under fire about saying black people genetically are different, so they should be under a different vaccine schedule. It's extremely dangerous rhetoric, because once you start saying you have to treat people medically different, that starts to allow for all of these different misconceptions to come in. And then, you're not too far from talking about things that sound like eugenics. But again, this is just a quick enlightenment on why DEI is important, because the knowledge to understand that these disparities exist that needs to be had by, honestly, our providers and just the non-medical people as well need to understand that these things exist and help try to stop. You can't stop the problem by not addressing it, by not talking about it, by not teaching it, by saying that talking about problems that black people face is reverse racism and teaching people to hate white people. Me saying that black people, for no known reason other than the fact that they're black, die at higher rates for things that white people are not dying at the same rate for, is not saying that white people are racist. It's saying that we need to address this problem for black people. But so many people get up in arms to try to defend themselves. They clutch their pearls and say that, are you calling me racist? It's like, no, I'm not calling you racist, but there's some type of racism happening from the system that needs to be addressed. So where the term DEI comes into play is, what have we done about it? So medical schools had started initiatives about increasing diversity because the data showed that when people have physicians or providers that look like them, they have better results, especially Black and Hispanic people. Their results tend to be a lot better when they have providers that are from their same culture. So they started putting benchmarks for, we need to increase diversity. And it was across race, ethnicity, and gender. And for a while, those things were increasing. Okay. There's currently only about 5% Black physicians, but med schools got up to being almost 9% Black. So there were efforts to increase that diversity. And now, as of a few weeks ago in the United States, schools openly doing that is in defiance of the federal government, because they're saying that doing that is reverse racism, it's discrimination, and it's not based on merit. Keep in mind that they're not just picking random people off the street. They're not taking unqualified people and putting them in med schools. So again, we've got a long way to go. Unfortunately, I think the executive orders, if they hang around a little longer, are going to make some of these problems worse, because now you're not allowed to openly talk about initiatives to combat these things. And of course, this is just talking about healthcare. I'll have other things talking about in the education system. We'll get into in other ways why DEI is good and has done good things. I'll have other episodes of why DEI is good, has done good things, because data shows that as the amount of Black physicians increase, as the amount of Hispanic physicians increase, etc., insert whatever stratifier you want, the care has gotten better in that respective category. And simply because people were responding better, maybe, or maybe the system that we have set up here discriminates against people that aren't, I guess, the status quo, because that's what the data shows. So again, this was just a quick little episode on DEI and healthcare in regards to Black History Month, and why it's extremely important that no matter what comes from the Oval Office, we have to continue to understand that there are things that need to be addressed simply because of, that diversity, equity, and inclusion are incredibly important, and things need to be addressed simply based on people being different races, people being different ethnicities, etc., people being different genders. And we can't just pretend like those things don't matter and those things aren't important, and we need to move to a society where we can't address those things. Maybe one day when we live in a society where everybody has equal access and is equal, then we don't have to purposely address those things when talking about education, when talking about healthcare. But that day is not today. So let's continue to strive for equal and fair and just treatment of all people. And with that being said, that's a nice short episode of A Day with Dre. Again, it's appreciated if you follow, like, subscribe A Day with Dre podcast, whether that's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Anything's appreciated. And y'all have a good Black History Month.